We're going to start out with a panel. We have, I think, 8 folks here, and they're going to speak for 3 minutes on one topic, which forces the mind to concentrate it's quite a distilled version of what they know. And then we'll have some time afterwards for questions. I should also say one thing that occurred to me this morning. We're going to be talking a lot about autonomous vehicles, and I think it's probably only a matter of time before we have a country song when a guy has his truck leave him as well. But I'm going to start out with Jeff Cole, who's going to give us some more interesting views of the future. Jeff is the director of the Center for Digital Future at USC. Jeff.
Thank you. I've never spoken in a room with 7 red Ferraris before. I was actually absent from school the day they took all the boys aside and explained why they should want Porsches and Ferraris. I actually love gadgets, which is why I'm so interested in driverless cars. I think driverless cars are going to change the world. I think they're the most important development of the next 30 years. They're going to change everything about commerce, housing patterns, human activity. They have the potential to eliminate 34,000 deaths a year and to greatly reduce traffic. But to share my vision of that would take 40 minutes, which I think is a pretty compelling 40 minutes, but some other time. What I'd like to talk about in what I have 2 minutes and 10 seconds left is the Uber accident in Arizona 2 months ago that many people think is a sign that driverless cars won't work. And I think there's 5 quick lessons we should learn from that accident. First, think of this as 1906, 3 years after the Wright brothers flew their first airplane. And in 1906, the only people you could get to fly in airplanes were the designers because they weren't certified for safety. And if an experimental airplane had crashed in 1906, as they did, people throughout the country said, "See, man wasn't meant to fly." So this is to be expected, not to defend it, but this is to be expected. Second, it's important to remember that what Uber was doing in Arizona and Pittsburgh is an experiment. It may turn out that the experiment wasn't as well designed as it should have been. Some people have said the experiment should have taken place on a closed track, but you really can't learn without an experiment on highways, and we may find better ways to do the experiment. Third is the Uber system was one of several different systems for driverless cars. Tesla had used Mobileye until they threw them out and created their own system. Google uses Waymo, when Google has said that if it had been one of our cars, the accident wouldn't have occurred. That may be true. That may just be competitive boasting. But it may turn out that the Uber system isn't the best system. Fourth, it's important to remember that on that same day the pedestrian died in Arizona, there were 93 other deaths from automobiles in America. This is something that's only getting attention because it's new. And lastly, not to point fingers, but there's a pretty good case that the pedestrian was at fault in Arizona. So this is something to be expected along the way. I think in 60 years, our grandchildren are going to marvel at the fact that we ever let human beings sit behind the wheel of dangerous weapons.
Thanks, Jeff. Least of all, sit behind the wheels of these Ferraris. Next up is Dan Eberhart. He's CEO of Canary, and he's, as he will tell you, an oil and gas guy. Dan.
Good morning, and thank you, Terry. So, as he said, I'm the CEO of Canary, and I'm an oil and gas guy. And the reason I'm up here is I really started thinking about this electric car phenomenon and what that was going to mean for our industry in oil and gas, and where it was going to take us, and what we should do to plan for the future. And as I looked on the internet, or the Google, as my brother would say, but as I looked on the internet and tried to find, do some of my own research, I really kind of stumbled in finding something authoritative and something that I could really sink my teeth into. So I decided to do a little bit of it myself, and with my team wrote a book, which is with the yellow cover out here, and we're giving away copies today. But basically, I think the oil and gas industry hasn't really has their head in the sand a little bit on this, and I think it's going to create, it's going to be transformative for what energy we need in the future and how we use energy. And I think the oil and gas space needs to think more about it. Just some facts. So about 29% of the total energy consumption in the U.S. is used as a transportation fuel. And these internal combustion engines we're using are roughly, depends on the engine, but roughly about 25% efficient in how they displace energy. It's thought that with these electric cars, we're going to be able to achieve about 70% efficiency. And so if you just see there in terms of the displacement and what we're doing, potentially we can have 45% more efficiency, which is over double where we're at currently, and it could really be transformative for how much energy we need and how much energy we use and where we need to find it. And that's one of the things I talk about in the book. And where that leads us is, that could potentially make the entire economy, the move from 25% to 70%, could make the entire economy in the U.S. 2% more efficient. Just think about that. I mean, that's pretty transformative if you apply that to a $17 trillion economy. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was I think that there are, for the long-term oil consumption use, I think in the U.S., Europe, Japan, you're going to see a much quicker adoption of electric vehicles and that kind of energy consumption. But what I think that's going to mean in the longer term is it's going to push the price of oil down, and that is in turn going to give the internal combustion engine another leg and another run of, I don't know, but 20, 30, 40 years in these emerging markets where the entry price of the car is really much more important than the overall life cycle cost of the car. The electric car is more expensive up front, but obviously less expensive over time as you use electricity. But in the emerging markets, it will enable them to keep the entry-level price of vehicles low, which will help more people drive and which will keep oil consumption moving, into the medium term, 10, 15, 25 years from now, as people in those countries also want to drive, also want to experience a car. And I'm out of time, so thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Note to Saudi Arabia, don't panic, I guess. Next speaker is Stefan Krauser. He's the CEO of EVelozcity and had worked a long time for BMW also.
So thank you to everybody who deserves thank you. We are limited on time, so this is my thank yous, and glad to be here today. To talk about this interesting topic. And actually this morning I asked my 4.5-year-old son, who's much more qualified to talk about the future of the automotive than myself, and to help me to understand what the future of the automotive is. And this is what he drew. So you see, the car doesn't look like a combustion engine car. It has a lot of seating, and you see a driver that's half asleep because the car is self-driving. So this is the future of the automobile. What we're trying to do with EVelozcity, and this is my main message today in 3 minutes, is we will not solve this problem that urgently needs to be solved with companies that think like combustion engine companies, that have business models like combustion engine companies, that run financials like combustion engine companies, that market like combustion engine companies, that use brands of combustion engine companies, and that have a mindset of combustion engine. And I think that's the big issue today, why some people are still not believing that this change will occur, because we're coming at this whole industry with a different mindset. Let me explain it to you. We don't believe differentiation in the future lies in the drivetrain any longer. We believe over time the electric drivetrains will be the same for everybody. So to seek a differentiation in electric drivetrains is your thinking out of combustion engine, where truly, obviously, you could make a differentiation in your engines and your drivetrains overall. Second, your design. Most of the electric cars we see out there, if I can say almost all of them, still look like combustion engine cars. And combustion engine cars mostly look like our horse carriages. Horses in the front, passenger cabin in the middle, trunk in the back, right? Why are we building this car still when we have now the opportunity to really restructure and re-architect the combustion engine cars. Third, I don't think people and the new companies will differentiate them in manufacturing. I think the modern world now, car manufacturer will not be equally to a car designer and car developer. I think the industry will separate into people manufacturing and separate into people designing and developing cars. That's why we have decided not to design our cars. And third and last, you have to think different in markets and customers. You're not going to think in countries thinking anymore. You're going to think in terms of cities, because that's where this is going to change. So going away from country thinking. So we're setting out 3 urban utilization cases. The one is obviously the commuter car. The second is the last mile car. And the last one is a ride-hailing car that's true to offer enough space for the paying consumer. We believe that these 3 use cases will drive the electrification in cities, because that's where we have to solve a problem. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Our next speaker is Ken Kresa, who's had many hats in his long career, including CEO of Northrop Grumman. But today he'll be talking to us in his capacity as former chair of General Motors.
No, I'm not going to talk as former chair of General Motors, because they'd probably kill me if what I'm going to say. And I'm not associated with General Motors anymore. What I want to say is that this transformation of the automobile in the next 30 years will change everything. This is extremely disruptive, and the world in 30 years will be very, very different. We'll have actually 2 different worlds. We'll have the urban world, where the trucks will still play the same way they play today, probably on gasoline, and then we'll have this electrified world where nobody owns cars, and it will be essentially an Uber class society that has driverless machines owned by major corporations, and people will lease them for their short moments of driving, and they won't own them. And this will be very disruptive to many, many industries. There'll be a loss of lots of jobs associated with the driving cars, obviously, all the truck drivers and cab drivers and so forth, the people that park cars, the insurance companies who insure cars, and car salesmen and so forth, and the oil industry, as we heard, will be very disrupted. There are predictions ranging all over the map, some that say this will happen rapidly, some will say it won't happen at all. I believe that it will be huge, and I use the Rethink X model, which is a company up in Northern California who have done a detailed analysis of what's going on. Their thesis is that the cost of transportation will dominate the game, and that the cost of transportation in 15 years will be so different. A driverless machine owned by a company will be so cheap that it makes no sense to own your own machine, and it'll be available to you, and that people will therefore start abandoning ownership, and lots of things will happen. And as people abandon their private vehicles, they're going to increase their disposable income enormously, which will be very positive for the economy. There's predictions that U.S. households will have an estimated $1 trillion increase in disposable income just by not owning cars. Productivity will increase. All of the time people spend driving to work, they'll now have available to work as well, and so we'll see an increase in productivity. And there's be enormous disruption to all kinds of industries. I've mentioned them, but the car building industry, as we now know it, will be very different. There'll be no sales, there'll be no dealers, and those will all go away. The parking industry, the insurance industry, the repair of cars that we know of, all of that industry is going away, and of course the oil industry. There'll be lots of opportunities, and there'll also be a new fear. And the new fear is, of course, the one of cyber protection. If you talk about all these unmanned systems, they're going to be vulnerable to cyber attacks. We have to figure that out, or this whole system won't work at all for anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. We will be figuring a lot of all of that out during this conference today. Our next speaker, Dakota Semler, is founder and CEO of Thor Trucks. Dakota.
So I'm going to touch a little bit today on something that we discussed earlier with Stefan earlier about a customer need. About 10 years ago, we were operating a fleet. We had about 300 trucks in Los Angeles County, and we were forced out of compliance. We were forced within 3 years to replace all of our trucks with newer technology that was cleaner and helped our air in this LA basin. We faced the challenge of refinancing a fleet of 300 vehicles in the middle of the recession or going out of business. And we did the latter, and we realized that it was a customer need that started this electrification interest in the commercial and heavy-duty electric space. So we set out to develop heavy-duty electric trucks to fulfill that need. And we think that this acceleration will actually happen a lot quicker than the consumer space or in the passenger car realm because of a few key things. One, there's forced compliance. When you look at areas like Los Angeles, areas like Stuttgart, capital of companies like Bosch, these are areas that are phasing out diesel in the next 10, 20, and 30 years, where no delivery vehicle will ever be allowed inside the city that has an internal combustion engine, let alone a diesel engine. Second, there's a clear TCO case. And when I say TCO, I'm referring to total cost of ownership. One of the things that we see in the short mile or the last mile delivery case, anything under 300 miles, is that we can actually create a compelling savings for fleets that operate electric vehicles over the diesel vehicles. So instead of them making the option to be electric because it's sexy or it's trending or it's the next best thing, it's actually the clear economic case, and that's what we want to drive home today.
Follow the money. Ryan Westrom is the mobility partnership lead for Greenfield Labs, which is Ford's Ford-leaning operations in Palo Alto.
Good morning, everybody. Indeed, I am here from Greenfield Labs, which is part of Ford Smart Mobility and Ford Motor Company. And a lot of times people ask us, why does a car company have a lab that is a partnership with a company like IDEO, who's known around the world for design thinking? And I think today, as we talk about the technology of AVs to come and the form factor and talk about them as machines and metal boxes, part of that becomes clear. I think that it is important for us to remember, and I'm exhorting all of us to remember as we discuss it today, that any of these devices, the cars that have been and cars that will come, operate for the human that is at the center of that design equation. And that is what Greenfield Labs is about. We are a human-centered design thinking firm that is aiming to help Ford think about the future of transportation. As has been said already, this transformation is coming, and we have this opportunity in front of us to shape it. And we can shape it well or shape it poorly. And I believe if we start at the human at the center of that equation, we can shape it extremely well. I'll borrow some thinking from a colleague of mine and note that the relationship that we have had with cars over the past 125 years has really been deeply emotional at its core. I mean, how many people here named their first car, had a nickname that they called the car that their parents drove them around in, right? I mean, this is a common thing. We think of the car as almost a member of our family, right? We assign sort of meaning to it, and that relationship is very emotional. And so I think as we think about the future, we see that there's been a lot of thinking already about the technology and the way that these things are going to come. But I think there's been less thinking about how that's going to change the relationship that all of us have with how we get around, with how mobility happens in the urban spaces and the world around us. And I think that meeting that emotional need to have connection is something that really provides an opportunity. And how are we going to have that emotional connection with the autonomous vehicle of the future? We as humans are storytelling animals. We assign a narrative to so much of what we do every day, every week, every month, and we link it all together. And I can't help but believe that the same is going to be true as we move into an era where technology provides us the opportunity to move around in kind of a new way. And seeing how that plays out, beginning with conversation today, is going to be absolutely fascinating. If we have anything to do with it, there's going to continue to be vehicles, but smart vehicles in a smart world. Thank you.
As we have discovered from our Russian friends, anything that we put online can and probably will be hacked. And of course, as we move further down the road with autonomous vehicles, a lot of that is going to be online. And so our next speaker, Brian Witten, works for Symantec. He used to work at DARPA, and so he knows a lot of what the bad stuff is out there. His job now is to protect us from that bad stuff. Brian.
Thank you. In the last 20 years of engineering, I've had the pleasure and fun of building security into countless kinds of things: spacecraft, aircraft, consumer electronics, computers, and even now tens of millions of connected cars. So what I've learned is there's never any single silver bullet. Building security into anything is about protecting the communications, protecting the cars themselves, keeping them up to date because security is never done, and then having a way of looking for those really stealthy or sophisticated attackers. That's not easy to do, but the good news is that a lot of the automakers have started doing this for, again, millions of cars. The bad news is that there are about 100 million cars a year that ship, the majority of them really without enough security. And the ones that are building security into cars, they're just now starting to build one or two of those cornerstones, not all three or four. So we're still very, very early in this journey, and we've already seen cars hacked and run off the road. And so, you know, that's disconcerting. And I think back over history where we embraced technology so quickly, and I'm really excited by the chance for autonomous vehicles to save so many lives. We have cars out there bumping into each other and killing people on a daily basis. And autonomy is a tremendous opportunity to change that. But at the same time, I look at the early decades of the internet connecting everything and how many computers got infected. And even more recently with things like Petya and WannaCry and a whole company shut down for days or weeks at a time. Mistakes that should have been learned years ago in terms of how to properly protect these things. A lot of companies are still learning them the hard way. And I hope we don't make those kinds of mistakes with cars. Because there's a lot more at stake. We bet millions of lives every day on these vehicles, whether they're rented or leased and you're just hailing a digital ride, or you own one and you keep it in your garage. We bet millions of lives every day on these vehicles. So we need to do a lot more to keep them safe. And for cars to be safe in the future, they're going to have to be digitally secure. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And our last speaker before we open up for questions is John Rossant, who was at the World Economic Forum for quite some time. He's the founder of NewCities and also of LA CoMotion, which was a very successful conference here last year, which some of you might have gone to downtown in LA. John.
Thanks very much. Well, all I can say is I thought I'd bring it down just slightly a notch and say that fasten your seatbelts because it's probably going to be a bumpy ride over the next decade or two. So we think of the post-war massive growth of the globalized car industry around the internal combustion engine over the last 60 or 70 years. Obviously, as previous speakers have said, we're at the cusp of massive disruption. Which is why we're having this conference in the first place, the electrification of everything, vehicle connectivity, the looming arrival of the autonomous world, etc. But I think the predecessors have talked about this on this panel, but I think it's important to look at some of the larger megatrends that are playing out and will continue to play out. One certainly is the accelerating, unprecedented urbanization of planet Earth. We're heading towards a planet that is 75% urban in just a couple of decades. And that means that the mobility revolution that we are entering will be increasingly and overwhelmingly an urban mobility story. And that changes a lot of things. At the same time, we have the enormous rise of the middle class, billions of people in the global south. and with aspirations, with dreams of road trips, with thoughts of piling the family in the back of their SUV, and we have to understand what that's going to mean. So the other thing is that there are going to be a lot of interesting new winners in this disruption that will last for decades. There are going to be losers also. I mean, who would have thought that Google would be a player in this universe? Who could have predicted a Tesla 10 years ago? One of the things that we look at closely also is certainly the rise of China as a big automotive power, and that's a subject that we're going to be getting back to later on today. I note that at the Beijing Auto Show just a few days ago, there were fully at 124 Chinese EV models presented, 124. And that's a lot, and a lot of those are going to be coming here. Lastly, I want to just talk about Los Angeles, because I think it's very pertinent for this audience. Los Angeles is the iconic car city of the universe. It's a car city. And we have to look. It is amazing that I have not seen one serious study of the economic impact of this disruption on the LA County economy. This is something that urgently needs to be done in a very profound way. We have to look at the job disruptions, et cetera. Very, very important. It's something that we look at and discuss at LA CoMotion, which I hope you all come to in November. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
Do these go on? Yeah. Cool. So the cool thing about keeping everyone to 3 minutes is we've got plenty of time for questions. I think we have some microphones in the audience. If you have a question, please put your hand up and we'll try and get to you. I see the gentleman right here in the front.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question of the gentleman in the oil industry. How do you see lithium-ion batteries, cobalt, lithium, graphite, as a new gasoline? Are there plans for oil companies to transition into that energy source? That's my question.
Sure. Okay. I wasn't sure if this was on or not. Thank you for the question. So I don't really think so. I think that the oil companies are hoping to get in on this in terms of natural gas as coal becomes less of a source of electricity, and I think coal right now is somewhere around a third of where the electricity comes from in the U.S. still, and natural gas is rising, and I think that's where the oil companies kind of see being able to get in on the economics of this happening. I don't know of any oil companies that are particularly focused on the cobalt or lithium or those aspects, or uranium. Even in the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of the oil companies that have had oil and gas exposure and exposure to mining have actually divested or split themselves up, so they're more focused on either oil and natural gas, or they're focused on other mining things, but they're not really connected so much anymore.
Jeff, do you have something?
If I could just add to that, I think the most remarkable quote of 2017, and I can't believe he didn't get fired for saying this, was the CEO of Shell Oil saying, "My next car will be an electric car."
Okay, we have another question here. We get a microphone to you.
So far, we've heard from 10 white American or European males. The big question is, 50% of the population is not white American or European males, and obviously minorities are the majority of the world population. Could you talk about the impact that this has on the future of the automobile, and when can we get some more diverse voices in this industry?
Who wants to take the diversity question? Dakota, go.
Yeah, this is a fun one to start with. I think from the commercial trucking sector and from a goods movement sector, this is probably going to be one of the best revolutions for minority, underprivileged, or low-income communities. If you look at today where logistics centers, where diesel emissions, and where pollution is centered around, it's in disadvantaged communities. It's disproportionately located near the lowest or the cheapest real estate, where zoning laws and high basically high-cost law firms and lobbying firms don't get really involved too much. So when we think of zero emissions vehicles or electric trucks, the big thing that we see is actually an improvement in air quality, an improvement in health conditions in those communities, but also access to being able to the goods economy as well. So one of the things we see is the way business models shift. I think Stefan mentioned this as well, is it's going to be big. So the entire auto industry is not going to be structured the way it is now, where there's an auto OEM, there's a fuel company, and there's a fuel distribution center. Many of those things are going to be merged. Some of them are going to be shared. Some of them will be assets that will be divulged to real estate holding companies. And so we need to think about how that impacts things. For us, we see it as actually bringing lower cost goods movement, which enables lower income communities to also have access to services or goods that they would have never had access to prior to this.
I will add on,
sure,
if I can. This allows me the chance to echo myself, which you should always take the opportunity to do. You're exactly right. And this is why we say that you have to begin with the human that's at the center of any of this business or industry. And the human that is around us in the world is very diverse, is of all socioeconomic classes. And so what does that mean for the future of getting around? One of the things that I think is really exciting about the opportunity that AVs will bring in time is the opportunity to just allow more access to mobility. The cost of moving around right now is actually relatively expensive if you're in a private vehicle. And as we've seen the movement of Uber and Lyft into urban centers and continued usage of transit systems that are growing around the world, what happens as mobility becomes easier seems to be that there are more trips being made. And we've heard some people speculate concern about, if people aren't owning vehicles anymore, if there is a trend in that direction, will there need to be as many cars? What will happen in that direction? I think, though, what we have to remember is that there's a really large untapped population of people who would probably be willing to make trips if they just could. And so that's the elderly, people who are perhaps unable to drive safely anymore. That is young people who aren't allowed out by themselves, perhaps in current conditions. But that's also people who might be from a lower socioeconomic class who are not able to move around due to the cost that it is. And so if per trip costs go down, I think that trip making can go up in major ways. And I think that's a trend that will be very interesting to watch. And I think that's something that will be very good and valuable for society.
We have a question. I think somebody has a microphone there.
I got it. Right here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so my name's Tim. I work for a large chemical company. We manufacture car refinish, which means we hope cars get in accidents so we can sell paint, right? That's our industry. But faced with what we've got as a strategic vision of how we're moving towards autonomous technology, aside from the powertrains and things that we use within the vehicle to motivate it, what do you tell an industry that currently has difficulty finding employees because nobody wants to be a mechanic when we look at the elimination or the significant reduction of a mechanical combustion engine when we're looking at electrification? There's an entire sub-segment of automotive service professionals are going to be affected by this. What do you tell a kid coming out of high school that kind of likes cars? Should he pursue that as an opportunity? I'm just looking at it from, what do we tell the next generation that are going to be fixing these cars, or lack thereof? Electric cars require far less maintenance than a combustion car. What do we tell them, and where are we going to find these people? That's my question.
Jeff, you want to start with that? There are probably a few views here. Yeah.
We're going to have that conversation, unfortunately, in quite a few different industries. If you look at checkers and supermarkets. But to your question, what do we tell mechanics? We actually had this conversation 108 years ago when 2 million Americans made their living through horses. Carriage makers, blacksmiths, people who cleaned up after horses, and those jobs disappeared. What's different is the automotive industry created more jobs than were lost with horses. I don't think that's going to be true this time. But that's we're talking about massive disruption, not just in this industry, but in quite a few industries.
Kent?
Yeah, I can only agree with that. I think they'll have a vision of what, the young people have a vision of what this all means, and they will see this as they don't want to own. Necessarily, their view will be not the same as a young person 30 years ago who dreamed at 15 or 16 that their whole life will change if they could only get a car. You see that people today don't have that as a vision. Some of them, you can't even, my grandchildren, I have a hard time getting them to get a license at 18.
Less than 50% of 18-year-olds have driver's licenses.
Right, and yeah, less than 15% of kids today at 18 have driver's licenses. That certainly wasn't true before. They see the change, they know the change, they are embracing the change. And so I think we won't have to say too much to the young people. They'll just tell us how it's going to be.
Dan, did you want to weigh in on that?
I just had something light to add. So one of the things I found when researching for this book is if you read a lot of the articles about when the horseless carriage was coming about, the most cited reason that people were excited about it and wanted them to proliferate was to get the manure off the streets. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting, and it shows like that was a problem that we don't even think about today, right?
And just get Central Park.
Yeah, I only want to add to the two questions, and one thing is very clear. This will change the face of the earth, and this will certainly change jobs and change future of people significantly, and we should make no secret out of it. That's, I think, the biggest challenge of moving into this new economy, into this different economy, that there will be a lot of people, a lot of jobs, a lot of professions that will disappear, and the social problems coming from it. I only wanted to add the one thought is, are we doing enough in the Western countries to not be the ones that lose out? Because one thing we know for sure, there are going to be more vehicles in the future than we're building today. So there's going to be more manufacturing. There is going to be a bigger economy. But if I look at how much the China is doing to foster this change and support this change, my question to America, my question to many European countries, are we sleeping? Are we trying to defend a traditional industry, defend traditional jobs to the demise then of our future potential for our young people as well?
We have a microphone back there.
Yeah, in the New York World Fair of early 1900s, Thomas Alva Edison approached a young entrepreneur called Henry Ford. They were both exhibiting cars. Alva Edison was exhibiting an electric car, and Henry Ford was exhibiting the first internal combustion engine car. This is more than 100 years ago. So how do I know that you're not crying wolf? Because the efficiency of the internal combustion engine cannot be matched. And in fact, improvement in CAFE standards are going to beat dollar by dollar, cent by cent, mile per mile, any cost of electric vehicles. So how do I know that we're not going to be having this conversation another 100 years down the road?
Edison against Ford. A few people want to chime in. Stefan and then Kent. Yeah.
Well, I would say that if you look at the total cost of the automobile, the electric vehicle is going to cost a lot less to manufacture and to maintain. And that will eventually win out because it's a very, very simple vehicle. And the maintenance is very low. And we're at a point now where electrification of our cities and so forth is coming very strongly. The need for the electricity in the car and the brains in the car and the computers and all the sensors is going to make the electrification of the car more important. So I think we're at a point now where it's about to switch over. There's no question that having on board the energy supply of the gasoline is better than the conversions, but I think the time has come when the simplicity of the electric car will win out. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I only agree, and I think that's exactly the thinking I was talking about. If we only think about product cost, or if we only think about battery efficiency and things like that, of course you can make the argument the combustion engine has a benefit. A combustion engine, in our opinion, for a long period of time will have a financial advantage on a product cost basis versus expensive batteries. And that's why we have to find the economics in the rest of the business model. And thank God the rest of the business model is so broken today that there's enough financial opportunity to compensate for higher product cost. So those companies that focus on product cost or efficiency only, in our view, are just not thinking how the whole economy is going to change. Look out to the city of Los Angeles today. That's the problem we're trying to solve, this traffic problem. The cost to environment, the cost to society, the cost to people's lives. That's what we have to look at, not only focus at product cost and product efficiency.
Yeah, I have something to add to that as well. So when you look at this space, not just from the commercial vehicle side, but also in passenger cars, with the advent of ride sharing, you're seeing higher asset utilization where a car will get more mileage, and particularly a truck will actually see more mileage than they've ever seen before. When you take a vehicle that's inherently lower cost to operate based upon the energy that you're utilizing, there's significant advantages as you use that vehicle longer and longer. So what they were alluding to, which is that we don't necessarily have to have cost parity right away, is the early part of the industry, but given economies of scale in manufacturing, not just in the passenger car side, but in the commercial side as well, we're seeing cost parity in the very near future of the actual acquisition cost of the vehicle and significantly lower cost to operate, maintain, and keep the vehicle on the road.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, I think talking about cost parity, I mean, what really is extraordinary over the last couple of years is just the massive decrease in the cost of solar and wind and other renewables. So that's, it is just really quite extraordinary. And so I think we're entering a whole new world where electric is the most efficient, most from an economic point of view. And that's really important to kind of understand, I think.
Jeff, you want to?
We just published a report on transportation, and you cannot generalize about these numbers, but to generalize, the average Toyota Corolla owner in America, it's based on gas price, insurance price, where you live, but we think we'll save a minimum of $400 a month in an electric, shared, driverless world. And incidentally, that report is available totally free. I'd never stand up here and direct you to something we're selling at our website, which is just digitalcenter.org, if anyone's interested.
Okay, where's the microphone? I can barely see it. Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you. I have two quick questions, one for Dakota, actually. The first one is the impact of lithium-ion batteries in our environment, and how do we plan on recycling these? The second question is, I was at FDIC, the Fire Department's Instructors Conference last week, and talking about big trucks and talking about fire trucks being relied on completely in diesel technology, and including several, so to say, small industries and small companies that are creating products to actually operate these trucks based on the diesel technology. How does that impact within that smaller industry? Is the EV good enough to be able to actually support what they need?
Yeah, I think in the emergency services world, the resiliency is still an issue and still a challenge. And not just in emergency services, but when you look at a transit customer, they want that grid resiliency, they want the vehicle resiliency that is expected of a diesel vehicle. So there still is progress that needs to be made in that front with electric vehicles. When it comes to lithium-ion batteries in particular, or batteries in general, the way we rate a lithium-ion battery or warrant it, is when it loses about 20% of its original state of charge or rated state of charge, meaning if it carries 100 kilowatt hours, the day it goes down to only being able to carry up to 80 kilowatt hours, that's when it falls out of warranty. And so when you actually, in a vehicle environment, there may be range sensitivity or space sensitivity or weight sensitivity where it doesn't make it functional in a vehicle environment. But as we start to onboard all of this renewable energy and generation, whether it be from solar or wind or other sources of energy, the grid is going to be increasingly reliant on storage. And storage applications are much less space sensitive. So we see a long second life future for all of the battery packs that are going into these vehicles. And from that, we estimate that we actually downrate the battery, and basically it becomes a grid resource for another 20 or 30 years.
Where's the microphone now? I see this gentleman here wants one, but we have one back there. Can we get the microphone to this gentleman here for the next question, please? Yeah, go in the back there, and then we'll get you the next. Okay.
I have a question.
Who has the microphone here?
I have the mic. Hi. So Governor Brown calls for 5 million EVs on the road. Electric companies like Southern California Edison calls for 7 million electric vehicles to be on the road. Going back to the gentleman's feedback, how do we get the adoption of disadvantaged communities and electric vehicles? As we know, Southern California Edison, 47% of disadvantaged communities are within Southern California Edison's territory. The other kind of feedback I'd like to get is about microtransits, your thoughts on microtransits and increasing the adoption of EVs.
Anyone?
Yeah, I can respond when it comes to disadvantaged communities. I think one of the things we're doing at a policy level within the state is, if you guys have seen the green or white or yellow stickers that were on the early Priuses and on electric vehicles like Teslas today, those have really forced adoption into some of the upper class or higher socioeconomic status individuals. And what's interesting is they have a retirement period. So as those vehicles become retired, or as the stickers become not relevant anymore, those will go into secondary markets. So that's a forced adoption curve through policy. I think there's also a number of other factors that are going to enable adoption in the passenger realm. The biggest driver being shared ride, and whether it be a platform like an Uber or it's a company like Waymo that's working on EV deployments more so than gas vehicles. I think the uptick is when you're going to start to see those platforms really become more prevalent from a consumer standpoint, which is when millennials and younger individuals in those disadvantaged communities start taking those rides.
And California already offers a $2,500 rebate on electric, which as of 2 years ago is no longer, higher incomes are no longer eligible, only for mid or lower incomes, and that $2,500 is on top of the federal government's $7,500.
And I think it's right that the main focus should be on the rideshare sense. As the cost of transportation comes down through some rideshare sense, and people abandon the state that you've got to have your own car to get wherever you want to go, and you can get where you want to go for a cheap amount or substantially less than today. That will advantage the disadvantaged areas. They will be able to commute and go various places with this new capability, which will start coming, and it'll really help that whole segment of the city.
I think if I could just speak to microtransit, and one of the interesting phenomena, certainly of the last couple of years, and it's accelerating, is the rise of LEVs, lightweight electric vehicles. So we shouldn't assume that people in the future will automatically go around in cars, whether they're autonomous or electric or shared, because it could well be some kind of electric scooters, electric bikes. These are skyrocketing in availability. The prices points are going down. I mean, anybody who's sort of spends 2 or 3 minutes in West LA can see the prevalence of birds and other motorized skateboards and things like that. And we see that now, and I just came back a couple days ago from Europe, and European cities, it's all over the place, bicycles, etc.
I would add, so Ford obviously operates a microtransit service in Chariot, and I come from the world of transportation. I'm originally a transportation planner and engineer, and having studied transit systems and the kind of bifurcation of trips that are made between transit, between personal vehicles, I am convinced that there's room in between those markets, between kind of the mass transit market and the personal vehicle-based market, which even if shared within an Uber or Lyft type vehicle, can't get the capacity that kind of a vehicle in between can. So we're very excited about what Chariot brings to the market, and that's somebody who we are working with as a lab to continue to iterate on what the future of microtransit will be.